Shoshenq's first decision to place his own son in charge of Thebes successfully brought Upper Egypt under centralized control. This consolidation of power, along with Shoshenq's ambition and leadership, paved the way for his military campaign in Palestine. With all of Egypt under his authority, he was able to mobilize troops and gather resources from across the country, even enlisting Nubian mercenaries. However, beneath this unified front, deep-seated ethnic tensions lingered between the predominantly Egyptian population of Upper Egypt and the ruling Libyan elite. The geographical and cultural divide between the southern city of Thebes and the Libyan capital, Janat, only widened the gap. Southern discontent was inevitable. The ruler who pushed his luck too far was Osorkon II, Shoshenq's first great-grandson, who reigned from 874 to 835 BC. During his lengthy rule, he focused much of his attention on his hometown, Bast, particularly its main temple dedicated to the cat goddess Batet. Among his grandest projects was a festival hall built to commemorate 30 years on the throne. Positioned at the temple's entrance, it was adorned with scenes of jubilation and royal rites that echoed the earliest traditions of Egypt. Architecturally, it followed the classic pharaonic style and rivaled the splendor of New Kingdom monuments. However, its placement in the remote central delta, far from the spiritual heart of Thebes, revealed Osorkon's provincial roots. His devotion to Bast continued with the construction of another temple in the city, this time honoring Mahes, the lion-headed son of Batet. But instead of earning admiration from the people of Thebes, his religious efforts were met with disdain. Eventually, the discontent in Upper Egypt reached a tipping point. The Thebans, eager for autonomy, began to rally behind a leader who could champion their cause. Naturally, their eyes turned to Ramesses, the high priest of Ammonius. Though he was only a second cousin to Osorkon II, his position carried immense symbolic power. As the spiritual and political leader of the Ammonius priesthood, Ramesses embodied the economic and political influence of both the great temple of Ipitsut and the wider southern region. Responding to public sentiment, Ramesses eventually claimed the royal title and declared himself king in Thebes midway through Osorkon II's reign. This was not unprecedented. 2 centuries earlier, other high priests had assumed royal status and ruled the south as an alternate dynasty, still connected by blood to the main ruling house in the north. Clearly, Ramesses and his supporters had taken note of history. Thebes' declaration of independence marked the collapse of Shoshenq's once unified kingdom and the end of his dream of a superpower. It signaled a return to the fragmented political landscape that followed the Ramesside era. Yet, Osorkon II appeared untroubled by this development. To him, decentralization was not a crisis, but a respected custom. He was willing to accept breakaway rulers, so long as they were family. After all, keeping leadership within the clan was the Libyan way. In reality, Ramesses' independent rule was brief and largely symbolic. The relationship between Thebes and the Delta continued as usual, revealing that genuine autonomy in the south was more illusion than fact. Still, the Ammonius priesthood, having had a taste of self-governance, showed no desire to return to centralized oversight. The principle of southern self-rule had been reasserted. Once set free, this idea could not be restrained. From this point forward, the temple and the monarchy would pursue separate paths, a division that would deeply affect the course of Egyptian civilization. In 838 BCE, Taklot, grandson of Osorkon II and the new high priest of Ammonius, continued the course set by Ramesses by declaring himself king and founding a formal rival dynasty in Thebes. Osorkon II died only 3 years later, seemingly at peace with the fragmentation of his kingdom and the decline of his royal authority. His burial items depicted him undergoing the weighing of the heart. Unlike past pharaohs, who assumed a guaranteed passage to the next world, Osorkon appeared uncertain about his own fate. As a farewell, his loyal military commander engraved a lament at the entrance of the royal tomb. Within 6 years of Osorkon II's passing, Thebes ceased to acknowledge even a nominal allegiance to the northern kings. From that point forward, All monuments and official records were dated according to Takelot II's independent reign. The entirety of Upper Egypt recognized the Theban king as their sovereign. The South's destiny now lay in the hands of Takelot and his descendants. However, not all in Thebes welcomed this shift. The dominance of Takelot's family over the immense wealth of the Ammonius priesthood stirred resentment, particularly among ambitious relatives who felt excluded. Although the Libyan tribal structure allowed for regional independence, it also bred fierce rivalries among branches of the extended royal clan. A decade into Takelot II's reign, one such relative decided to challenge his authority. Backed quietly by the northern king, Patabastet declared himself ruler of Thebes in 827 BCE, directly opposing Takelot. The south now had two competing claimants to the throne. For Takelot, a traditional Libyan ruler, there was only one answer: military intervention. From his fortified base at Tajeh, he sent his son and heir, Prince Osorkon, on a military expedition down the Nile to retake Thebes and reassert his family's claim. The campaign was successful. Prince Osorkon's forces restored order across Upper Egypt. According to the records, what had been destroyed in every city in Upper Egypt was reestablished. The enemies of the land, which had fallen into chaos, were subdued. Upon entering Thebes, the prince participated in a religious procession to display his devotion and gain legitimacy. Afterward, the entire Ammonius priesthood and all regional governors formally pledged their loyalty to him. In a public ceremony, they hailed him as the brave defender of all the gods, divinely chosen by Ammonius from among countless thousands to fulfill his heart's desire. Given the alternative, their allegiance was likely driven by fear as much as faith. Once in power, Prince Osorkon dealt with the rebels with ruthless severity. His victory inscription recounts their punishment. They were shackled, paraded before him, and carried away like goats on the night of the evening sacrifice. As a brutal deterrent, each was publicly burned at the sight of their defiance, sending a clear and terrifying message to anyone who might consider rebellion. With his enemies quite literally turned to ash, Prince Osorkon turned his focus to restoring order in Thebes. He reaffirmed the revenues allocated to the temple, addressed petitions, oversaw the appointment of minor officials, and issued a series of new decrees. His administrative flurry came with a stern warning. Whoever dares to violate this decree I have issued shall suffer the wrath of Ammonius, to be consumed by the fire of Mut in her fury, and his son shall not succeed him. To this he added, with no shortage of confidence, while my name shall remain strong and endure for all eternity. The stones of Ipit-Sut must have seemed to echo their approval, for after the upheavals of recent times, here was a prince fashioned in the traditional mold. The following year, Prince Osorkon returned to Thebes on 3 separate occasions, participating in major religious festivals and presenting offerings to the gods. He likely believed that his visible piety and frequent appearances might win hearts and prevent future unrest. He miscalculated. Rather than calming the opposition, his ruthless crackdown on dissent only deepened the bitterness within the priesthood. In 823 BCE, a second large-scale rebellion erupted, once again with Patabastet at its head. This great convulsion plunged the region into civil conflict, dividing families and officials along political lines. This time, Patabastet emerged victorious, having secured the backing of high-ranking Theban authorities. He quickly moved to strengthen his grip on power by placing loyalists in key positions. Thebes slipped from the hands of Osorkon and his father, Takelot II, who withdrew to their northern bastion to regroup and lament their loss. For a time, lawlessness reigned. Years passed during which men preyed upon one another without resistance. Yet if recent history revealed anything, it was that Theban loyalty was fragile and easily swayed. Roughly a decade later, Prince Osorkon returned to Thebes, this time reinstated as high priest of Ammonius. His return was met with fawning praise. "We rejoice because of you. You have no enemies, for they no longer exist." But the words rang hollow. Patabastet had not disappeared, and the death of Taklot II soon after only served to bolster the rival faction. A third uprising in 810 BCE saw Patabastet retake Thebes, but by 806, Osorkon had returned once more, making grand offerings to the gods. Just a year later, the tide turned again, with Patabastet back in control. This latest defeat proved more damaging, and Osorkon was forced to retreat yet again to the fortified crag of Ammonius, weighing his next move. Patabastet's death in 802 reshuffled the political landscape. His successor lacked the same tenacity, and by 796, nearly 10 years after his last expulsion, Prince Osorkon made a determined return to Thebes. This time he was prepared. His brother, General Bekempta, held command at the fortress of Heracleopolis and brought with him a considerable military force. Together, the brothers stormed Thebes and defeated all those who had stood against them. After 3 decades of conflict, Prince Osorkon at last secured uncontested rule over Thebes. For the next 80 years, under his reign and that of his descendants, Upper Egypt remained under the control of Taklot II's lineage, fulfilling the old king's vision. Their public devotion to Ammonius of Ipitsut had finally borne fruit. However, far to the south, in the distant lands of Upper Nubia, another group of rulers had been watching Thebes' turmoil with growing concern. In their eyes, such discord in the holy city of the supreme god was intolerable. They came to a grim conclusion. Only one course of action could purge Egypt of its irreverence. A sacred war was inevitable. During the height of the 18th dynasty, the decisive victories of Thutmose I and Thutmose III in Nubia extended Egyptian control as far south as the Fourth Cataract and effectively dismantled the kingdom of Kush. Though defeated, Kush was not erased. Time and again, throughout history, the Nubians demonstrated remarkable endurance. After the fall of a new kingdom, they did exactly that. Kush re-emerged as a dominant power, and its rulers, once more sovereign in their homeland, prospered through trade with sub-Saharan Africa. By the mid-9th century BCE, they were constructing elaborate tombs in their native style, far surpassing the meager burial monuments of their Libyan counterparts in Egypt. The kings of Kush believed they were superior in yet another, more profound way. They saw themselves as the true custodians of Egyptian kingship. This bold belief was a direct result of Egypt's former imperial reach. When Thutmose first invaded Kush, he brought not only his soldiers, but also the high priest of Ammonius. His goal was not just military conquest over Val Kush, but also religious conversion. Continuing that mission, Thutmose III built a grand temple to Ammonius at the base of Gebel Barkal, Nubia's most sacred mountain. Egyptian ideology declared Gebel Barkal to be Ammonius' southern dwelling and a spiritual counterpart to Ipitsut in Thebes. A dramatic pinnacle of rock at one end of the mountain, shaped like a rearing cobra crowned with the white crown of Upper Egypt, was seen as proof of divine kingship. These symbols allowed the Egyptians to claim that Gebel Barkal was the original birthplace of pharaonic power, making Nubia a natural extension of Upper Egypt. Once again, religious ideology was used to legitimize Egypt's rule. What the Egyptians failed to anticipate, however, was that this same propaganda would one day be turned against them. The Nubian elite had embraced the cult of Ammonius and the belief in Gebel Barkal's sanctity so deeply that these ideas remained central to their identity long after Egypt's retreat from the region. By the 10th century BCE, a Nubian queen could confidently present herself as a righteous warrior, expanding Ammonius' influence into foreign lands. The Kushite rulers of the 8th century were equally zealous in their devotion. Around 780 BCE, Alara, a Kushite leader who called himself a son of Ammonius, restored the ruined temple at Gebel Barkal. His successor, Kashta, took a bolder step, proclaiming himself the legitimate ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Extending his reach northward into Upper Egypt, he prepared to make that claim a reality. The decline of Theban authority under the ineffective heirs of Prince Osorkon offered the Kushites both the justification and the opportunity to act. During the reign of Osorkon's son, King Rudaman, the Kushite leader Pianki advanced his claim over Upper Egypt. Confronted with the formidable reputation of Nubian military power, the Thebans quickly submitted. With little resistance, Pianki succeeded in reuniting the two great religious centers of Ipitsut, effectively restoring the former New Kingdom Empire, but now under Nubian rule. Adding a layer of historical irony, Pianki adopted the throne name of Thutmose I, aligning himself with the very pharaoh who had once subjugated Kush and declared Gebel Barkal a sacred site. In return for acknowledging Nubian supremacy, Rudaman and his successors were allowed to retain their royal status, though only within the confines of a diminished realm centered at Heracleopolis. Thebes, meanwhile, was surrendered to its new rulers from the south. Perhaps surprisingly, Pianki lived up to his reputation as a devout and fair ruler. He generously allowed members of Rudaman's family to retain positions of influence within the Theban hierarchy. Among them, the most prominent was Shepenwepet, Rudaman's half-sister. As the god's wife of Ammonius, she held the highest-ranking female role in the Ammonius priesthood, on par with the high priest in terms of ceremonial importance. In fact, it was through her that her father, Prince Osorkon, had continued to exert influence over the priesthood even after proclaiming himself king. By allowing Shepenwepet to remain in office, Pianki demonstrated a notable level of tolerance for the old regime. Beyond Thebes, Pianki saw signs of instability forming in the northern Nile Valley. The last thing he needed was unrest in his newly acquired Egyptian stronghold. Maintaining a careful balance of power in Thebes was a smart move, especially with greater conflicts looming on the horizon. Those conflicts weren't long in arriving. In the 70 years since Prince Osorkon had re-established control over Thebes, Egypt had descended into unprecedented political chaos. The Libyan tradition of multiple parallel dynasties had spiraled out of control. In Upper Egypt alone, aside from Pianki himself, 2 other kings remained in power. Both rulers had managed to reach uneasy compromises with Pianki that allowed them to keep their thrones, though with diminished authority. Lower Egypt, meanwhile, was in even greater disarray. The direct descendants of Shoshenq I were confined to their ancestral seat in Bast, while other areas of the delta were ruled by a confusing mix of petty kings and local leaders. Tarimu had its own king, Iapet II, and other towns were controlled by a patchwork of tribal chiefs of the Ma, hereditary nobles, and regional governors. Pianki referred to them all dismissively as the feather-wearing chiefs of Lower Egypt. He clearly saw through the absurdity of so many self-styled dual kings, choosing instead to reserve that prestigious title for himself and reducing his rivals to mere kings in his own records. Among these many contenders, one stood out as a genuine threat. Tefnacht, the ruler of Sais in the western delta, did not bother claiming royal titles. As the great chief of the West, he had already amassed considerable power. By 740 BCE, he had seized Perwajet, Buto, and over the next 10 years, expanded his influence across much of the western delta, incorporating more provinces into his growing domain. Unlike the ceremonial kings around him, Tefnacht wielded real authority. In late 739 BCE, while Pianki was seated in his palace at Napata beneath the sacred cliffs of Gebel Barkal, a storm began to break. A messenger was ushered through pillared corridors, past guards stationed in the waiting chamber, and finally into the royal hall to deliver the grim news. Tefnacht has taken control of the entire western region, reaching as far south as Ichtai. The situation quickly worsened. The leader of Sais was now marching south with a formidable army. Cities along both sides of Nile were surrendering without resistance. Heracleopolis was under siege, and Egyptian officials were defecting en masse, described as rushing to his side like dogs at his heels. Tefnacht's momentum seemed unstoppable. To make matters worse, Nimlet, the Libyan king of Kuman, had renounced his alliance with the Kushites and joined the rebellion. The time for patience had passed. Pianki was left with no choice but to respond. He had to defend Thebes and its sacred temples from the advancing threat of these impious invaders. Devout and determined in equal parts, Pianki responded swiftly and without hesitation. The Kushite forces already stationed in Egypt were ordered to advance, confront the enemy, surround them, and take them captive. Special vengeance was reserved for the defector Nimlet. Meanwhile, Pianki summoned the main army from Nubia and sent them forth with a sacred purpose. Ammonius, the god, commands this. Their mission was not merely military. Before continuing their march north, Pianki instructed them to follow a strict spiritual protocol. When you arrive at the heart of Thebes before Ipit-Sut, immerse yourselves in the river, cleanse your bodies, and dress in fresh linen. Only then were they to make offerings to Ammonius, bow before his temple, and ask for divine direction. Lead us, so that we may fight with your strength surrounding us. The Nubian soldiers carried out Pianki's instructions exactly, then moved on to confront their enemies. They scored a decisive victory in a fierce naval clash south of Kmon and another on land near Heracleopolis. Soon after, Pianki received troubling news. Furious, the Kushite king resolved to personally lead the campaign, but only after celebrating the New Year festival in honor of Ammonius. In the meantime, his army sealed off the entire province of Kmon to prevent Nimlet from slipping away again. Following a brief stop in Thebes to reaffirm his religious devotion, Pianki reached the outskirts of Kmon in early 728 BC. Like Ramesses II before the Battle of Kadesh, he appeared in his royal chariot to rally his forces before launching the attack. On his command, a relentless bombardment of the city began, continuing day after day as the siege tightened. Eventually, Kmon began to exude a foul odor. Not long after, the city surrendered. Pianki claimed its riches, including Nimlet's royal crown, which was presented as a symbol of defeat. In a desperate plea for mercy, Nimlet's female relatives approached Pianki's wives, daughters, and sisters, hoping for compassion from woman to woman. As for Nimlet himself, he bowed before his conqueror with two carefully chosen gifts, a sister made of gold and lapis lazuli, and a horse. Pianki, like all Kushite rulers, had a deep affection for horses. Pleased by both the offering and the gesture, he later had the moment immortalized on his victory monument at the Temple of Ammonius in Gebel Barkal. Pianki's love for horses was further revealed a few hours later during a visit to Nimlet's palace. Of all the sights, 2 rooms captured his attention. What happened next spoke volumes about his character and priorities. Nimlet's wives and daughters greeted Pianki and paid him the honors expected of defeated royalty. But he ignored them entirely. Instead, he made his way to the stables, where he discovered the horses were unfed. Outraged, he exclaimed, "It pains me more to see my horses go hungry than all the wrongs you have committed." Pianki would not be the last ruler in history to favor horses over people. The next to capitulate was King Pefjawaibast of Heracleopolis, once an ally of the Kushites. His submission marked the full surrender of Upper Egypt. However, bringing Lower Egypt under control would prove far more challenging. The first objective in this new stage of the campaign was a group of rebels, including one of Tefnak's sons, who had fortified themselves in a stronghold near the entrance to the Fayum. Upon arriving at the fortress, Pianki denounced them as the living dead, threatening complete destruction if they did not yield within the hour. His fierce rhetoric had the desired impact. Keen to present himself as a merciful leader, Pianki ordered that no harm come to the inhabitants. Nonetheless, the fort's grain stores, like those of Kmon before it, were seized and offered to the temple of Ammonius at Ipit-Sut. It was a divine reward for the god he so fervently served. The Kushite advance continued unimpeded. Town after town submitted. Among them was the ancient Middle Kingdom capital of Ichtai, still a key center in the northern Nile Valley. Eventually, Pianki arrived at the ultimate goal of his campaign, the capital city of Memphis. Once again, he attempted diplomacy, urging the citizens not to resist. He promised to honor their patron god, Ptah, and then continue northward without violence. To bolster his appeal, He pointed to his prior acts of clemency. Look at the southern provinces. Not a single innocent life was lost. Only those who had defied the gods were punished. But Memphis rejected his entreaties, closing its gates and preparing for a siege. Under the cover of night, Tefnacht himself made a covert visit to the city to rally its defenders. He understood that without Memphis, his resistance would collapse. Before dawn, he quietly exited the city, slipping past the Kushite lines before his presence was even detected. When Pianki learned of the secret visit, he was furious. Dismissing the advice of his generals, he personally led the assault on Memphis, committing all available resources to its capture. Once the city fell, Pianki remained true to his word. He promptly entered the temple of Ptah and performed the appropriate rituals, emphasizing once again that his campaign was not one of conquest, but a holy mission to cleanse Egypt and restore its sacred traditions. With Memphis subdued and nearby fortresses surrendering, rulers from across the delta began flocking to Pianki to offer submission. Among them were King Iapet II of Tarimu, the chief of the Ma, Akhenash of Jebnecher, and Prince Padiz of Hutherib. When Pianki visited Yenu to perform sacrifices in the temple of Ra, King Osorkon IV of Bast came to witness the majesty of Pianki firsthand. This weakened remnant of the Libyan dynasty wanted to see with his own eyes the power that had restored royal authority to Egypt. Following Osorkon's example, the assembled rulers of Lower Egypt pledged loyalty to Pianki and offered generous tributes. They declared, "Allow us to return to our cities and open our treasuries, so that we may present you with whatever your heart desires, including the finest horses and the best of our stables." Clearly, they were well aware of the Nubian king's love of horses. Pianki, unsurprisingly, accepted their offerings. When the final, lackluster uprising against Kushite authority was quickly crushed, Tefnacht recognized that his resistance had run its course. He dispatched envoys to Pianki, not to formally surrender, but to propose a ceasefire. Though he cloaked his message in deference, Tefnacht was fully aware that he still held a strong bargaining position. Much of the western delta remained under his control, and his forces could prolong the conflict indefinitely if he chose to resist. To demonstrate his confidence, Tefnacht declined to present himself personally before Pianki. Instead, he audaciously requested that a Kushite delegation travel to meet him at his capital in Sais. It was hardly the resolution Pianki had envisioned, but in the interest of avoiding a drawn-out war of attrition, he accepted. So, in the temple of Neith at Sais, Tefnacht finally pledged allegiance to Egypt's new, unquestioned overlord. The following day, Pianki witnessed a powerful and symbolic act of submission. The four reigning kings, each adorned with the royal uraeus, were brought before him. One by one, they prostrated themselves and kissed the ground at his feet. Egypt may have had 5 claimants to the throne, but only one true sovereign. The symbolism of the moment was unmistakable. It had taken a king from Nubia to restore the majesty of the Egyptian monarchy. Before returning to Thebes, his ships heavy with the spoils of war, Pianki made a final declaration of his religious fervor. Of the 4 rulers who had bowed before him, only Nimlet was permitted to enter the royal precinct. The others were excluded not for their past opposition, but for violating Pianki's stringent codes of ritual purity. They were uncircumcised and had consumed fish. Under Kushite rule, military might was tightly intertwined with moral absolutism. The fusion of power and piety would become a potent force in Egypt's future. After thoroughly defeating all opposition and asserting Kushite supremacy across Egypt, Pianki might have basked in his triumph and relished the full honors of pharaonic rule. Yet, true to his Nubian roots, he remained unwaveringly loyal to his homeland. Following his victorious campaign in 728 BCE, Pianki turned southward, making a brief stop in Thebes to appoint his daughter as the future god's wife of Ammonius. This strategic move ensured the continued presence of Kushite authority in the city sacred to Ammonius. Having paid his respects to the deity, Pianki and his entourage resumed their journey. 4 days of sailing brought them to Abu, the southern border of Egypt, and within a month, they were safely back in Napata, nestled beneath the massive silhouette of Gebel Barkal. Resettled in his expansive palace, Pianki ruled for another 12 prosperous years, a time of abundance for Kush. Yet he never again set foot in Egypt. His approach to Egypt revealed much about his motivations for launching the campaign. Had political domination been his true aim, Pianki would likely have installed trusted governors to administer Egyptian territories on his behalf. But his mission had been primarily religious, to defend Ammonius' sacred sites from foreign influence. Having fulfilled that goal, he showed little interest in managing Egypt's internal affairs. The Libyan rulers were quick to recognize this. No sooner had Pianki returned home than Egypt's northern leaders resumed their old behaviors. Osorkon IV of Bast continued to portray himself as the legitimate pharaoh, even dispatching an opulent gift to the Assyrian king who appeared at Egypt's northeastern border with a powerful army. In the Delta, Akhenaten of Shebnejer resumed rule as though nothing had changed, and Pianki's former nemesis, Tefnakt, now openly adopted the royal title of king. It was as if the Kushite conquest had been erased from history. Tefnakt's earlier refusal to personally bow before Pianki had, in hindsight, foretold the region's future defiance. His domain remained a dominant force in the Delta's shifting political landscape, as he continued efforts to expand his reach across Lower Egypt. Tefnakt died in 720 BCE, but his ambitions did not die with him. His successor, Baconrenuf, proved equally resolute, equally ambitious, and just as resistant to Kushite authority. His disdain was immortalized in a striking piece of royal propaganda, a ceremonial goblet crafted from pale blue faience. One upper band showed Baconrenuf receiving the ankh from his patron deity Neith of Sais, flanked by the gods Horus and Thoth, protectively sheltered by celestial vultures bearing symbols of eternity. A bold expression of Sate pride and aspiration. More provocatively, the goblet's lower band depicted bound Kushite captives interspersed with images of monkeys pilfering dates from palm trees. It was a crude racial insult, laced with symbolism, and in keeping with the long-standing pharaonic tradition of using art as political messaging. The new king of Kush, Shabako, had just ascended to the throne when he was met with a grave insult he couldn't ignore. Unlike Pianki, his predecessor, Shabako was determined to see things through and eliminate his opposition once and for all. Launching a renewed Kushite offensive into Egypt, he pressed forward until he had captured Baconrenuf and neutralized him as a potential rallying point for resistance. Later accounts claim Shabako had Baconrenuf executed by fire as a sacrificial offering. Whether or not this is true, the Kushite king showed no hesitation in asserting his dominance throughout Egypt. In Memphis, for example, he personally intervened in the burial of a sacred Apis bull, altering the inscription on the tomb from year 6 of Baconrenuf to year 2 of Shabako. Within months, his authority extended across both eastern and western parts of the Delta, and he marked the occasion with a commemorative scarab. It proclaimed his victories in stark language, celebrating the defeat of rebels in both Upper and Lower Egypt, as well as in foreign lands. With the north subdued, Shabako turned his focus southward. Thebes and its surrounding region had generally leaned in favor of the Kushites. But Shabako wasn't one to leave loyalty to chance. Though the influential office of God's wife of Ammonius was already held by Kashta's daughter, Amenertis I, and set to pass to Pianki's daughter, Shepenwepet II, Shabako recognized that control over other key posts in the Ammonius priesthood was necessary to secure unwavering support in Thebes. He began by installing his own son as high priest of Ammonius, a position he stripped of any political or military authority to limit its independence. Loyal supporters were then placed in other significant roles. In the years that followed, a royal prince was appointed second prophet of Ammonius, and a royal princess was married to the mayor of Thebes to ensure his allegiance. It appeared that Thebes was firmly under Kushite control. Yet the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. The Theban elite maintained a strong desire for autonomy. The city's mayors, while outwardly professing loyalty to the Nubian kings, ran Thebes and its surroundings like their own private domain. They elevated their kin into influential roles within both the civil and religious institutions and enjoyed the wealth and power that came with it. One prominent figure was Harwa, born into a priestly family during Pianki's reign. He rose to lead the household of Amenertus I and continued serving her successor, Shepenwepet II, a self-styled intellectual. He described himself on one of his statues as a savior for the desperate and a guide for the lost. His tomb, one of the grandest ever built for a non-royal, reflected his high status. Hidden within its walls, a shabby figurine was depicted holding the crook and flail, symbols traditionally reserved for kings. Harwa clearly saw himself as a kind of monarch in Thebes. This informal dynasty operating under Shabako's nominal rule highlighted the limits of Kushite authority. In reality, it was nearly impossible for a single monarch and centralized administration to govern such a vast territory. Despite Shabako's claims of sweeping reform, he had little choice but to leave existing political frameworks intact. In the Delta, local leaders recovered swiftly from their previous defeats. Men who openly called themselves kings continued to rule in places like Bast and Janet, the old centers of Libyan power. Hereditary rulers retained control in Hudariab, while other long-standing dynasties resumed their grip over the prosperous cities of Jeddu, Jedet, Tjebnecher, and Persopdu. Even Sais did not stay subdued for long. Following Baconrinif's grim fate, a new power emerged in the form of Nekau, who quickly began adopting royal titles of his own. Beneath the surface of a supposedly unified monarchy, the fragmented political landscape Pianki had encountered in 728 BCE remained largely unchanged. This wasn't merely history repeating itself. In another significant way, the Kushite monarchy marked a return to Egypt's ancient traditions. Deeply devoted to Ammonius, Pianki and his successors considered it their sacred duty to restore Egypt's cultural integrity. Their spiritual mission went beyond reviving Ammonius' worship. It also aimed to re-establish Egypt's traditional values and practices. With strong backing from the royal court, artists and priests began to draw inspiration from earlier dynasties, resurrecting and reimagining elements from Egypt's classical past. This reverence for antiquity quickly permeated all aspects of cultural life. Shabako set the tone by adopting the throne name of Pepi II, evoking the grandeur of the Old Kingdom. His successor took it a step further, reviving a royal title last used by the 5th dynasty king Isisi. Top officials followed the trend, embracing long outdated, often symbolic titles simply for their historical significance. Even the written word was deliberately cleansed, with scribes reverting to archaic Old Kingdom forms and learning to craft new documents in a style that echoed the ancient idiom. One notable example of this cultural revival was the Memphite theology, a theological work that explored the role of the god Ptah. Shabako commissioned the text himself, claiming it was a faithful copy of a decaying, ancient papyrus preserved in the temple archives. The language was convincingly archaic, so much so that it misled scholars upon its modern discovery. But like many aspects of the Kushite cultural revival, the Memphite theology was a carefully constructed illusion. It reflected an imagined golden age of cultural purity, cherished by the Kushite reformers. Ptah's renewed importance, alongside Ammonius, also marked the resurgence of Memphis as Egypt's central seat of power. This echoed its former role as the capital before Egypt's fragmentation following the last Ramesside king. Memphis was ideally positioned to oversee both the Nile Delta and the Southern Valley, hence its ancient title, Balance of the Two Lands. Additionally, the Kushite kings were deeply intrigued by the rulers of the Old Kingdom, whose pyramids still loomed over the Memphite region. When Pianki passed through Memphis during his 728 BCE campaign, the pyramids clearly left a lasting impression. Upon returning to Nubia, he ordered the construction of a pyramid of his own, thereby transforming the style of royal burials in his homeland. His tomb embraced many traditional Egyptian features, New Kingdom-style shabby figurines, passages from the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, and selections from the pyramid texts. Yet, even in his burial, Pianki maintained a distinctly Nubian identity. Alongside these Egyptian symbols, he made space in his tomb for a team of horses. This fusion of Egyptian and Kushite elements brought a fresh vitality to the artistic expression of the time, breathing new life into the royal workshops. In sculpture, artists deliberately revived the proportions of the Old Kingdom, favoring a stocky, muscular portrayal of male figures that resonated with the Kushite ruler's self-image. The close-fitting cap crown, commonly worn by Kushite kings, was likely chosen for its ancient origins. At the same time, certain distinctly Nubian traits became unmistakable in royal portraiture. These artworks, both magnificent and conflicted, mirrored the central paradox of Kushite rule. Although these kings from Upper Nubia went to great lengths to appear as authentically Egyptian as possible, they remained outsiders, shaped by a deeply different African heritage. The result was a cultural blend that was not always entirely harmonious. Kushite dominance reached its uneasy peak during the reign of Pianki's son, Taharko. He maintained the archaizing trend of his predecessors, constructing a Nubian pyramid modeled on those of the Old Kingdom, while designing its inner chambers in imitation of a New Kingdom's Osirian tomb at Abydos. In his pursuit to revive Egypt's golden age, Taharko launched widespread temple restoration projects, from distant Meroe in the southern reaches of Nubia to Janet in the northeast delta. Among these initiatives, the restoration of the temple at Djimpitan seemed to hold special importance for Taharko. Positioned on the Nile's east bank at the terminus of a major route from Napata, the temple had been started by Amenhotep III and expanded under Tutankhamun. For the Kushites, Djimpitan represented everything they sought to reclaim. Taharko not only re-established its endowments, but also brought in Memphis's finest artisans to embellish the site. Their experience with Old Kingdom funerary architecture clearly left its mark on the project, likely in line with Taharko's vision. One notable example is a relief of the king depicted as a sphinx trampling Libyan enemies. Drawing on the past to shape the present was a tradition the Kushites eagerly embraced. If Taharko's religious efforts were meant to gain divine favor for his reign and his dynasty, early signs suggested his prayers were answered. In the 6th year of his rule, after petitioning the gods for a bountiful flood, Nubia received unexpected rainfall, drenching the hills and raising the Nile's water steadily. At Karnak, the river swelled to an exceptional height of 21 cubits. Even more remarkable were the benefits that followed. The fields flourished, vermin and snakes were wiped out, locusts failed to descend, and the usual dry southern winds did not spoil the harvest. So moved was Taharko by these for perfect wonders that he had them immortalized in inscriptions at both Djimpitan and Janet. To commemorate this extraordinary event, Taharko's mother made the long journey from Napata to Egypt, marking her first visit since he had taken the throne. The reunion carried deep emotional weight for the king. I left her as a young man of 20 when I traveled with His Majesty Shabako to Lower Egypt. And now, after all these years, she sails north to see me. In that moment, the usually formal barrier between sovereign and subject gave way to a rare glimpse of personal affection and familial devotion. Taharko, having inherited the warrior spirit of his Kushite ancestors, mourned Egypt's diminished stature on the international stage. Determined to correct this decline, he knew that re-establishing Egypt's former glory required a strong, well-trained army capable of projecting power beyond its borders, as it once had. To this end, the king and his military devoted significant effort to building physical endurance, with long-distance running serving as a cornerstone of their training regimen. In one remarkable instance, Taharko personally mounted his horse to observe his troops in action. He joined them during a nighttime drill across the desert behind Memphis, starting at the 9th hour of the night. They reached the shores of the Great Lake by sunrise and returned to the royal residence by the 3rd hour of the day, covering close to 60 miles in just 6 hours. This feat demonstrated the soldiers' extraordinary stamina and discipline. Their rigorous preparation soon bore fruit. A campaign against Libya yielded considerable spoils, which were presented at Karnak. This victory was followed by a string of military operations in Palestine and Lebanon, allowing Taharko to push Egypt's influence along the Mediterranean coast as far north as Kebni. While his accomplishments did not rival the expansive conquests of the great warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom, they marked a significant and promising resurgence. However, the dream of fully reviving Egypt's imperial dominance was ultimately out of reach. Taharko's aspirations collided with those of another powerful ruler in the region. Originating from its core along the Tigris River, the Assyrian kingdom first took note of its Nile-based counterpart during the early 15th century BCE. After Thutmose first began Egypt's imperial expansion into the Near East, the two powers maintained a cautious relationship. Assyria sent tribute to Thutmose III after the Battle of Megiddo and later kept formal ties with Akhenaten's court. However, just as Egypt faced periods of instability, Assyria too fell into decline, and by 1000 BCE, it had shrunk back to its traditional strongholds around Ashur and Nineveh. Once again, the fortunes of the two civilizations seemed to run parallel. By the 8th century, as the Kushite dynasty began consolidating its grip over the Nile Valley, Assyria was undergoing a dramatic resurgence under the leadership of Tiglath-Pileser III. His methods were brutal and highly centralized. Newly conquered lands were placed under the authority of governors appointed directly by the crown, with their loyalty monitored through frequent royal inspections. To weaken regional identities and suppress resistance, mass deportations were enforced. By the time Shabako rose to power in both Kush and Egypt, much of the Near East was firmly under Assyrian control and suffering under its oppressive rule. In the face of such a formidable adversary, Shabako initially adopted a policy of careful diplomacy. His resolve was tested when the rebellious ruler of Ashdod sought refuge in Egypt. Shabako, unwilling to provoke Assyria, returned the fugitive to his pursuers. But this uneasy peace was short-lived. When Sennacherib intensified efforts to secure Assyria's western borders, Egypt began covertly backing rebellious city-states in the region, hoping to undermine Assyrian authority from within. The gambit backfired dramatically. Sennacherib launched a campaign to crush the uprising in Palestine, prompting Hezekiah of Judah to appeal to Egypt for military aid. It was a request Shabako could hardly ignore. He called upon his nephew Taharko, then a young prince of 20, to lead the Egyptian forces north from Nubia. The two sides met near El Takei, just 10 miles from Ashdod, in 701 BCE. Taharko's army was encircled and suffered a serious defeat. He fell back to regroup, hoping to strike once the Assyrians moved on to besiege Jerusalem. But Sennacherib proved too astute. He swiftly recalled his troops from Judah, turned to confront the Egyptian threat, and drove Taharko's forces into full retreat. The Kushite prince returned to Egypt defeated and demoralized. In that moment, it became clear Egypt had encountered an adversary it could not easily overcome. The Kushite dream of regional dominance had met a formidable and unyielding reality. The rise of Esarhaddon to the Assyrian throne in 680 BC marked the beginning of the end for Kushite dominance in Egypt. As ambitious and relentless as his predecessors, Esarhaddon was determined to bring the Nile Valley under Assyrian control. His first offensive came in 674, but Taharko, well prepared from recent military training, successfully repelled the attack. Despite the victory, Taharko sensed the danger was far from over. He openly lamented what he saw as the abandonment of divine support, a reflection of his growing anxiety. His concerns proved well-founded. Just 3 years later, Esarhaddon personally led a much larger and more formidable invasion force, sweeping through the Near East with relentless momentum. After destroying Tyre, the Assyrians advanced swiftly toward the Egyptian delta. Memphis, the seat of royal power, soon found itself under siege. Facing overwhelming odds, Taharko had little choice but to flee, leaving behind his wife and children, who fell into Assyrian hands. Within mere hours, the fortified city was overrun and looted. Among the spoils were lavish treasures, hundreds of golden crowns adorned with serpents, thousands of silver talents, and tens of thousands of horses. Esarhaddon exulted in his triumph, boasting of his capture of Taharko's queen, palace women, Ushinku, Nejuiner, other children, livestock, and untold wealth, all taken back to Assyria as plunder. To commemorate the victory, he had an inscription carved depicting the Kushite crown prince kneeling in submission, a rope tied around his neck. Additional inscriptions were erected on key points along the route home, including one at Nar el-Kelb in Lebanon. The Assyrian conquest brought dramatic changes to Egypt. Delta cities were renamed with Assyrian titles, and a new administrative structure was installed, complete with governors, port authorities, and court officials handpicked by Esarhaddon. Among these appointees was the cunning Nekau of Sais, who quickly gained legitimacy and was soon recognized as a king by neighboring rulers in the Delta. When Taharko made his return to Memphis in 670, he found himself hemmed in by adversaries on all fronts. A third invasion loomed in 669, but was unexpectedly halted when Esarhaddon died on his way to Egypt. For the embattled Kushites, it offered only a brief reprieve. Indeed, a third invasion came just 2 years later, this time under the command of Assyria's new and most ruthless ruler, Ashurbanipal. One of his very first acts as king was to launch this campaign, and he did so with unwavering confidence. Egypt was swiftly overwhelmed. Taharko, upon hearing of his army's defeat while still in Memphis, was thrown into despair. Gripped by panic, he abandoned the city and fled south to Thebes in a desperate bid to preserve his life. There, he had to contend with a fresh uprising in the southern provinces, sparked by the instability. Meanwhile, Ashurbanipal imposed direct Assyrian control over Egypt, securing oaths of loyalty from rulers throughout both Upper and Lower Egypt, and installing Assyrian officials in positions of power. Egypt had effectively become another province in the Assyrian Empire. Yet the very internal divisions that had long undermined Kushite rule now provided a flicker of opportunity. As soon as Ashurbanipal withdrew his forces, a number of local rulers began secretly conspiring with Taharko in hopes of reclaiming Egyptian independence. Their efforts might have succeeded if not for the Assyrians' highly efficient intelligence network. Once the plot was uncovered, Assyrian authorities acted swiftly. The rebel kings were arrested, shackled, and ironed, and the towns that supported them were brutally punished. The inhabitants, young and old, were massacred. Corpses were impaled on stakes, their skins flayed and draped over the city walls as a grim warning to all. Public executions swept across the Delta, and the leaders of the rebellion were deported to Nineveh, where they awaited Ashurbanipal's judgment. Only Nekau of Sais survived, managing to convince the Assyrians of his loyalty. He was reinstated as governor of his former domain. As a sign of renewed trust, Nekau's son Samtek was given an Assyrian name and installed as the new ruler of Hutherib, replacing its former prince who had been executed with the other rebels. Once again, the shrewd rulers of Sais managed to survive the storm. Just as Tefnacht had opposed Pianki and Bacon-Renuf had resisted Shabako, a new generation of Sates was now ready to challenge the Kushites for supremacy in Egypt. Taharko died in 664 BCE, broken and defeated. But his successor, Tenudaman, was not ready to give up. Against overwhelming odds, he mounted a final campaign to reclaim the Nile Valley from Assyrian domination. Declaring himself under the protection of Ammonius, Tenudaman turned his campaign into a spiritual crusade. He ordered the rebuilding of desecrated temples, made religious offerings, and reinstated priests who had been displaced by the Assyrians. His message was clear. A holy mission would once again restore Egypt's sanctity and sovereignty. This time, however, the opposition was no longer a scattered group of petty rulers. The enemy was now a powerful, organized, and experienced occupying force. Marching on Memphis, Tenudaman achieved an early symbolic victory. Rebels emerged to fight, and his army inflicted heavy casualties. Nekau, the prominent collaborator, was captured and executed, while other local rulers opted not to resist, instead retreating behind the defenses of their cities, like rats into their holes. Tenudaman took up residence in Memphis, awaiting the formal surrender of his enemies. Within days, the mayor of Persoptu appeared before him, begging for mercy. In a calculated political move, Tenudaman spared his rivals and allowed them to continue governing their towns, recognizing the benefits of stability over vengeance. When he returned to Napata, he proclaimed his success in restoring Egypt's fortunes. Southerners journeyed north, and Northerners came south to bring the best of Upper and Lower Egypt's bounty to delight His Majesty. It was the final declaration of triumph a Kushite king would ever make. Tenudaman's reign over Egypt was incredibly short-lived. By the end of 664 BCE, only months after his resurgence, Ashurbanipal launched a swift retaliation for the Kushite resurgence and the execution of his loyal ally, Nekau. This second Assyrian invasion saw Memphis fall quickly. But Memphis was not the primary objective this time. Ashurbanipal's true target was Thebes, Egypt's religious heartland and a longtime stronghold of Kushite support. After a grueling 40-day march, the Assyrian forces reached the city gates. Tenudaman barely managed to escape before the Mesopotamian troops surged into Thebes. They looted its temples and seized treasures that had been collected over 14 centuries. The plundering of Thebes sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, regarded as a cultural disaster of monumental scale. Ashurbanipal made no attempt to downplay his triumph, stating bluntly, "I made Egypt and Nubia feel the bitter force of my weapons." The Kushites were forced to retreat all the way back to Nubia, where they would remain. With that, Egypt fell under full Assyrian control. However, Ashurbanipal's assumption that this victory would usher in a lasting era of Assyrian dominance in Egypt failed to consider the resilience and cunning of the rulers of Sais. The Western Delta, historically insignificant due to its sparse population and limited agricultural yield, had nonetheless proven a potent power base before. Now, a new Sate leader, Psamtik, son of Nekau, aimed to fulfill the ambitions of his forebears and bring all of Egypt under his leadership. Appointed by the Assyrians in 671 BCE to govern Hutherib and Yenu, Psamtik later inherited Memphis and Sais from his father, consolidating control over 4 key regions. This collection of territories formed a vast, connected domain, making Psamtik the most powerful of all the Assyrian-aligned rulers in the Delta. What's more, his time spent in Nineveh had taught him invaluable lessons in diplomacy and ruthless leadership. Now, Psamtik was ready to apply those lessons, turning them to his advantage in the next phase of Egypt's turbulent political history. Harsh lessons had made Psamtik understand that political ambition meant little without military dominance. Though he was still nominally a vassal of Assyria, he quietly began building up his own forces. Establishing an army within Egypt was too risky under Assyrian scrutiny, and Egypt's recent military defeats had highlighted just how far behind they had fallen in terms of tactics and weaponry. Psamtik aimed for excellence, and he knew exactly where to look for it. Drawing on his connections across the Mediterranean, he enlisted skilled mercenaries from Ionia and Curia, regions along the Aegean coast of Asia Minor. These seasoned fighters were stationed in garrisons at strategic locations along the delta's edge. Further strengthening his position, Psamtik formed alliances with the king of Lydia and the autocratic ruler of Samos, a Greek island. These diplomatic ties helped expand and enhance the Egyptian navy. While the rise of Greek officers in the military hierarchy unsettled Egypt's traditional warrior elite, there was little they could do in the face of Psamtik's determined leadership. His strategy yielded swift and significant results. Within a short time, 2 of the 4 Libyan principalities bordering the Western Kingdom had submitted to his authority. The remaining 2 soon followed, granting Psamtik dominance over much of the central and southern delta. Soon after, the regions of Jadet and Persoptu came under his control. The last holdout was Janet, ruled by the direct descendant of the famed Shoshenq I, who likely considered himself just as legitimate a claimant as Psamtik, the ambitious upstart from Egypt's less distinguished western delta. But by 656 BCE, even he conceded. After nearly a decade of careful diplomacy and strategic pressure, Psamtik stood as the uncontested ruler of Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt, however, still remained outside his direct control. Following the plundering of Thebes, the Assyrians had departed, leaving local authority in the hands of Monchemat, the city's mayor. A powerful figure and close relative of Harwa, Monchemat had served the Kushite regime faithfully and was even married to a Kushite princess. During the height of Taharko's power, these ties had boosted his career. But as the political landscape shifted, they became increasingly inconvenient. Still, Monchemat was a shrewd political operator, adept at adapting to new realities. To reinforce his strong local influence, he threw himself into repairing the damage left by the Assyrians. He restored temples, initiated significant construction projects, and worked tirelessly to return Thebes to its former grandeur. Among his many projects was his own tomb. When it came time to decorate its final sections, Monchemat carefully portrayed his wife not as a Nubian princess, but as the very image of traditional Egyptian womanhood. Through such calculated decisions, Monchemat retained his position as the de facto leader of Upper Egypt, governing from Kmun to Abu across 3 successive regimes. In true Theban fashion of careful neutrality, official records from the city continued to acknowledge the declining Kushite dynasty throughout the first 8 years of Psamtik's reign. 2 daughters of the most prominent Nubian kings still held the highest-ranking religious positions in Thebes, serving respectively as the god's wife of Ammonius and the divine adoratrix of Ammonius. Faced with such deeply entrenched tradition and ceremonial authority, a provincial Libyan noble from the western delta stood little chance of rivaling their influence. Psamtik understood that true control of the south hinged on gaining dominance over the Ammonius priesthood. On March 2, 656 BCE, an impressive fleet of ships departed from Memphis, bound for Thebes. The convoy included supply vessels, support boats, and at its center, a royal bark gleaming with gold under the spring sun. Leading the 600-mile expedition was Semetautifnacht, Prince of Heracleopolis and Egypt's chief harbor master. He was tasked with organizing the voyage and collecting provisions from the regional governors whose territories the flotilla would traverse. Much like the ancient following of Horus, this strategy both spared the royal treasury and offered local officials a chance to prove their loyalty through generous contributions. Among the many luxurious items aboard the fleet was a particularly significant passenger, Psamtik's young daughter, Princess Nitocret. She was leaving the royal household to fulfill a destiny carefully crafted by her father. After 16 days of sailing, the procession arrived in Thebes, where throngs of locals gathered along the riverbank to witness the princess's arrival. Before she could absorb her surroundings, officials escorted her to the grand temple of Ammonius Ra at Ipit-Sut, where she was received by the god's oracle. Once the rites were completed, Nitocret was introduced to Shepenwepet II and Amenertis II. To the Delta-born princess, these regal, dark-skinned African women must have appeared unfamiliar and imposing. Rather than displacing the current god's wife and her successor, a move that could have alienated the southern elite, Psamtik had opted for a more nuanced solution. He negotiated the adoption of his daughter as the future occupant of the post, thereby securing both religious influence and southern allegiance. It was a brilliant diplomatic move. It also proved to be a financial windfall. The formal adoption was accompanied by a detailed written agreement that left no room for ambiguity. Central to the document was a clause transferring all the assets of the god's wife to Nitocret, which effectively placed them under Psamtik's control. The princess would receive daily and monthly provisions from leading Theban officials, whose compliance was mandatory. Chief among them was Monchemat, who pledged daily offerings of bread, milk, cakes, and herbs, along with 3 oxen and 5 geese each month. His Kushite wife and eldest son also joined the list of contributors, thereby reaffirming their allegiance to the new ruling order. The landmark assembly at Ibit Sut in 656 symbolized a pivotal moment in Egypt's history, gathering figures representing all major factions of the nation's recent past. Monchemat embodied the last vestiges of Thebes' old aristocracy. Shepenwepet, Amenertus, and the high priest of Ammonius. Harkabi stood for the Kushite legacy. Semetodifnacht represented the emerging northern regime, and at the center stood young Nitocret, the living emblem of Sate ascendancy. The ceremony marked more than a religious or political event. To solidify his control over Upper Egypt, Psamtik sent one of his most capable generals to Thebes. His mission was clear: suppress any signs of rebellion, establish a military outpost at Abu, and monitor Nubian activity closely. The Sate regime governed with diplomacy backed by strength, and it had no intention of allowing Tenudaman, his lineage, or loyalists to rekindle unrest in the south. But the proud Kushite spirit refused to yield. After Tenudaman's passing in 653 BCE, a new wave of Nubian rulers once again turned their attention northward, eager to reclaim their lost Egyptian domain. Patiently and carefully, they rebuilt their military and bided their time. That opportunity seemed to arise in 593 BCE. The reigning pharaoh, Psamtik II, had only recently come to power and was seemingly more preoccupied with affairs in the Near East than with his southern frontier. Seeing this as a moment of weakness, the Kushites mobilized their full army in Lower Nubia in preparation for an invasion. But they had gravely misjudged their opponent. Unlike his grandfather, Psamtik II had no interest in indulging Kushite aspirations. For 50 years, Upper Egypt had been firmly integrated into the Sate realm. Nitocret had formally assumed the role of God's wife of Ammonius, and all key administrative roles in Thebes were now held by loyal officials from the north. The Nile Valley was finally reunited under strong central authority for the first time in nearly 5 centuries. No Kushite assault was going to reverse that. Alerted to the impending attack, Psamtik II acted swiftly. He dispatched a campaign force southward into Nubia and accompanied it as far as Abu himself. His army, led by seasoned Ionian, Carian, and Judean mercenaries, made a bold advance. Along the way, they paused at the temple of Abu Simbel, where some carved their names into the legs of Ramesses II's colossal statues. Pressing onward, they devastated the town of Nubs in a brutal display reminiscent of 18th dynasty warfare. Psamtik's soldiers, it was said, waded through the blood of the slain as though it were water. Their campaign did not end until they reached Napata, where they looted and destroyed the royal palace and demolished statues of Kushite kings. Upon his return to Egypt, Psamtik II ordered the erasure of all references to Kushite rulers from monuments, including private statues. Through both physical force and ritual erasure, the Sate king aimed to eliminate the Kushite legacy from Egyptian memory altogether. After 135 years of rivalry between the two dynasties, this campaign marked the final, emphatic assertion of Sate dominance. For Egypt's new rulers, the victory was not only political but deeply personal. Revenge had never been so complete.